All right, welcome back to Chapter 33. This is Part 2, and we're up to the WPA, another one of FDR's programs as part of the New Deal to address the mass unemployment we were experiencing during the Great Depression. Set up in 1935, it's going to spend ultimately $11 billion in all kinds of public works projects, building roads, bridges, and so forth. Some 9 million Americans are going to get a job over the 8 years of the existence of this program. And it's just a selection of some of the things the WPA could have been working on, again, like paving roads, building schools, providing school lunches, that kind of thing. And it's not just public works in terms of infrastructure being built. We're going to see money spent on sending adults back to school who had never gotten their high school diploma. Money spent on interviewing former slaves who are now elderly, and this is the last chance to kind of get their stories recorded for history. And also a lot of murals and other forms of art. Many of these you'll find in places like schools and post offices. Now, when we're going to look at two women in the context of the New Deal. And the first one we're going to look at is our very first female cabinet member. This is Secretary of Labor Frances Perkins. So again, she makes a lot of history by being the very first woman in the president's cabinet. Our next woman is Mary McLeod Bethune. While not in the cabinet, technically speaking, she did work in the FDR administration, and she formed her own group of African-American advisors. She called her Black Cabinet, and she would report back to FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt, trying to make sure that this New Deal is not just for white Americans, but for all Americans. Now, let's move on and look at some other organizations. The first we're going to look at now is the NRA, or the National Recovery Administration. This is a very complex program, one that's got industry, labor, and unemployed all kind of focused together to try to put the economy back on track. I guess, remember, we talked about the 3 R's, relief, recovery, and reform. This has got recovery and reform built into it. And the way this would work is that the industries would work together. So say all railroads or steel plants or whatever, they would work together to come up with what they called codes of fair competition. This meant putting in place things like a minimum wage in their industry or a maximum work hour ceiling. This would spread the work over more people. So instead of having one person work 40 hours, you could have 2 people working 20 hours a week. The NRA, there's the Blue Eagle, very popular symbol of the NRA. And as we talked about in class, this is actually where the Philadelphia Eagles get their name, is from the Blue Eagle. Now, the NRA is not without its problems. Firstly, it is just way too complicated, too much too quickly. They're expecting businesses to kind of actually adhere to the rules they come up with. They're expecting workers to follow these rules about working only so many hours or whatever the situation is. And so there's going to be some people kind of cutting corners. And while it looks like they're following NRA rules, they're actually kind of not. And that is not the major problem. The major problem is actually legal. In 1935, the Supreme Court decides that the NRA is in fact unconstitutional. We call this the Schechter case. The reason being is they decided that the federal government was trying to regulate business both interstate and intrastate, and of course the Constitution limits Congress from regulating just interstate commerce, not commerce within states. And so the NRA's failure is a really telling sign that there are some problems to come with FDR's plan, that even though he's got all kinds of ideas, not all of these ideas will actually get fulfilled. So we're back to the farmers, and as we've looked at, we know the major problem facing farmers this time is low crop prices and high debts. And so the only way you can fix the low prices for crops is to, of course, cut back on production. Well, how in the world do you get poor farmers who are already desperate to stop farming? And the answer is you pay them to reduce their crop output. You pay them not to farm as much or not to farm at all with certain crops to try to bring prices up. You cut supply, and then as the demand stays steady, prices will go up to match. And this is not without controversy. It's part of it is just the fact you're paying farmers not to farm, but it's also the fact that this is a time period where Americans are desperate and hungry, and here we are destroying crops so that farmers can meet those quotas. And like the NRA, the AAA is going to be killed off by the Supreme Court. All right, now a quick overview of the Dust Bowl. You can see this is the Dust Bowl sort of at its peak. This is really, when you think of the Dust Bowl and all those images you see in your mind, this is kind of the area we're really focused on, right there at the meeting place of Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and New Mexico. So what explains the Dust Bowl? Part of it is the fact that during World War I, farmers had been urged to plant. Food would win the war. And this results in farmers planting on areas that probably should not have been farmed. Lands that were, in the best of years, wet enough to farm, but in a lot of years not really wet enough. In other words, you're not going to get enough rain. And in the 1920s, the rains were plentiful, and people began plowing up lands that really should not have been plowed up. And then in the 1930s, Mother Nature decides she doesn't want to do that anymore, and a massive drought hits, a drought that's going to last the better part of a decade. And what happens is that soil that had been exposed for the first time, really ever, is going to dry out, and the winds that whip over the plains are going to pick that soil up. Millions of tons of topsoil are going to roll through in these things called black blizzards. And it's hard to imagine what a black blizzard would have been like for someone who didn't live through it. I mean, it certainly does look apocalyptic, this giant mountain range of dirt coming at you and people fleeing for their lives, trying to get out of the way. And the result, mass migrations. People are going to leave, and many of our dust bowlers are going to head for California and hope for work and better life. That's the subject of the famous novel by John Steinbeck, The Grapes of Wrath. Now, we're going to look at the Native Americans briefly, see what's going on there. This brings us to an important law called the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, also known informally as the Indian New Deal. And what this law does is it tries to kind of turn back some of those assimilationist policies of the 1892 Dawes Act. So it's going to encourage Native Americans to set up sort of self-government. It's going to recognize tribal ownership of land as opposed to individual ownership of land, and this is going to help stop the loss of Indian lands as we go forward. So very important law, and it's kind of a bookend to a lot of the topics we've been looking at with Native Americans throughout this year. Back to the banks. Back to the banks. So we've got to try to correct some of the problems that led to the Great Depression in the first place. This would be the reform aspect of the 3 R's. And the SEC is a good example of this. It's designed to try to protect people from some pretty shady business practices, things like insider trading and fraud and just outright deception. And this is a watchdog agency designed to protect you as the investor. TVA. Well, Tennessee Valley Authority is a product of a need to do something with the Tennessee River Valley, this area right through here, a very poor area of the country, an area that was tended to flood, and they desperately needed help. And so a hydroelectric project in which you would put dams on the Tennessee River and perhaps other rivers that flow into the Tennessee would create jobs, it would create cheap electricity and totally transform this area. And that's basically what's going to happen. Now, this is not without its controversy, though. There were critics who didn't like the idea of the TVA being signed into law here, competing with private electric companies, because those companies simply can't compete with the government, because the government's producing things at cost, not for a profit. As the critics of the TVA said, this is creeping socialism in concrete. Nonetheless, this TVA thing is a remarkable transformation for the Tennessee Valley. We're going to see unemployment drop. We're going to see people have electricity for the first time in their homes, and floods will be less likely because of these dams that will control the flow of water through this area. All right, Social Security, something that you won't have to worry about for many years, but it's there as a result of the Social Security Act of 1935. And this does a whole bunch of different things. It's going to provide unemployment insurance. So if you're out of a job, you can draw on the Social Security Fund. If you are above a certain age and you're retired and you need some income, you can draw on Social Security. And if you have some sort of disability which prevents you from working, this will allow you to draw on the Social Security Fund. And this fund is coming from basically you, the employer, or excuse me, you, the employee, and also your employer, both paying into a tax. So this will be again, money that you and your employer are paying into, and then you can draw on them as needed. Now, this is like many things in the New Deal, not without some sort of criticism. The Republicans in particular felt that this Social Security thing was just one more step towards socialism. And you see that criticism a lot with the New Deal, that the government's simply getting too big, that people are becoming too dependent on the government, and that with Social Security, workers will become lazy. They'll somehow not feel the need to work very hard because they always have Social Security to rely on. All right, a New Deal for labor. So we're going to look now at the Wagner Act, which sets up the National Labor Relations Board, or NLRB. And this is going to work as sort of a go-between agency between workers and business to help resolve worker strife and working strikes or whatever the situation is. It's going to assert, again, that workers have the right to organize. That means to build a labor union and bargain collectively. Another piece of legislation tied in with that will be the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. This is going to establish minimum wages and maximum hours. Now, this is kind of a reaction to the NRA in that this is going to target only interstate commerce, so only businesses that cross state lines. That's the only place Congress can actually regulate. Another piece of this law that's important is child labor is finally done away with. So if you think about how often we've talked about child labor when it comes to industrialization, that's finally now coming to an end in 1938. This is not a catch. It's not going to catch everyone, though. There are exclusions. If you worked in farming or you were a domestic worker, like many African American women were, you were left out. You were not covered by things like the minimum wages in this bill. All right, we're going to pick up the election in 1936 in part 3.